Hello, I am Alina Freire Fierro, an Ecuadorian botanist from Universidad Regional Amazónica ICAM, and a fellow from the South China Botanical Garden, Chinese Academy of Sciences. I am also a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution and at Universidad Técnica de Cotopaxi. Today, I will talk about the contributions from undergraduate students who have made towards the increase in knowledge, conservation, and applicabilities of botanical diversity in Ecuador. This presentation is in co-authorship with these former students and with colleagues from Universidad Técnica de Cotopaxi, which is located in the central Andean part of Ecuador.
To begin, I would like to remind you about the location of Ecuador. It is a small country in South America that comprises an area of almost 284,000 square kilometers, and it's located between 1 degree north and 5 degrees south of the equator. Despite its small size, in Ecuador we have two biodiversity hotspots: the Chocó Darien hotspot and the Tropical Andes hotspot. In terms of animal diversity, Ecuador registers 8% of amphibian, 5% of reptiles, 8% of mammals, and 16% of bird species from the world. Considering that Ecuador has 0.2% of the world's land area, we can confirm the high diversity in the country. These high numbers of species is due to the values of endemism that are very high too. For example, Ecuador has 294 species of amphibians, 44 of birds, etc., that are endemic to this country. Despite zoological taxa have been heavily studied, new species are being discovered constantly. For example, the El Oro parakeet was described as new about 25 years ago, and a new rodent was discovered just a year ago at the Cordillera del Condor in southeastern Ecuador. Regarding vascular plants, Ecuador has more than 18,000 species, and almost 5,500 species are endemic to the country. On an area comparison, the number of species among others botanically rich countries, Ecuador is by far the largest and has the highest density of species per square kilometer. In the Americas, and despite its small area, Ecuador is the fifth in terms of botanical diversity after Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru.
This high and unique biodiversity is studied mainly by researchers from several of the 59 primarily undergraduate institutions. And very few studies related with botany or with plants are carried out at the only 8 graduate programs. Since so far there are 0 graduate programs in botany in Ecuador, long-term botanical studies are carried out basically by foreign universities, and only short-term studies are done by undergraduate students.
One of the primarily undergraduate universities is Universidad Técnica de Cotopaxi, located in the Ecuadorian Central Andes. The results to be discussed here are based on the preliminary research done by former undergraduate students from the natural resources and humanities faculties, who were attending this university while I was working there as a visiting professor and as the curator of the UTC herbarium. During my 2 years at UTC, we had 6 undergraduate students who carried out several plant-related projects in agroindustry, graphic design, community-based tourism, medicinal plants, and ecotourism. Their projects were carried out in the Cotopaxi and or Imbabura provinces. Here, we'll see how undergraduate research can contribute towards biodiversity conservation. The vouchers were collected with a Ministry of Environment permit and were deposited at the UTSIC Herbarium in Latacunga, Ecuador. Among the preliminary data we obtained from this research, we could mention that the highest percentage of species collected corresponded to Asteraceae, Fabaceae, Lamiaceae, etc. As examples, on the Asteraceae, we can mention Baccharis latifolia, which is a medicinal plant, or Chuquiraga arcuata, which is being studied by another undergraduate student. And in the Fabaceae family, we have, for example, Inga edulis, the cotton tree, and also Lupinus, which includes the lupine beans that are eaten in local markets in the country. Carla Fuentes did a study on the weeds from the field located in the Belisario Quevedo County, and her study was directed towards identifying and describing the species found in this field with the purpose of educating the community and through a guide about the importance of plants to people. In her study, the majority of species were native, though almost a third of them were introduced. As a student of graphic design, she prepared plates depicting botanical morphology of the species in a visually attractive manner. The following study, carried out by Andrea Pachacama, was focused on medicinal plants sold in several markets in Latacunga in the Cotopaxi province. For her work, she interviewed the vendors and collected vouchers for the herbarium. The product of her research was a guide with information obtained from the interviews, the literature, and virtual resources such as Plants JSTOR, Tropicos, GBIF, among others. This guide was presented to the vendors so they could have their knowledge documented for future generations. The vendors, of course, were included in the guide as co-authors. From her study, it was clear that medicinal plants are widely distributed and most of them were of exotic origin. In this study on community-based tourism, Lisette Gavilanes, in collaboration with Habitats from an indigenous community in the Canchagua County, produced a guide about the plants from the area with the purpose of providing these inhabitants with information to be shared with tourists visiting the sacred mountain called Cerro Huingopana, pictured here. Again, people who participated in the interviews were also listed as co-authors of the guide. In this case, though the majority of species studied were natives, almost a third was introduced. Evelyn Zurita, pictured here during the defense of her final project, did a study on the natural history of plant species located in a mountain nearby the UTSEC Herbarium at the university campus, where in this area a downhill mountain biking activities occurs every year. Her study was with the purpose of documenting the diversity and ecological interactions of species in the mountain in order for her to recommend the best place for the location of these bike trails. In this study, 100% of the species are native. In the last study, Jenny Carua and Brian Arguero carried a study to determine the presence of mucilage in native species at the Putzalagua volcano in Cotopaxi and in Peguche in Imbabura. Their study was done also with the purpose of describing the botanical species that tested positive for mucilages, so future researchers in agroindustry could recognize the various mucilaginous species from Ecuador. In their study, they registered the majority of species as native. As a result, they determined for the first time the presence of mucilages in the species belonging to, for example, to the Amaranthaceae, Asteraceae, and Calceolariaceae. This is a promissory work that could guide future research in the agro-industry area. As a summary, we can observe that with the exception of the studies on native species for mucilages on the left and for the ecotourism on the right, in the others it was possible to determine the presence of exotic species. With these results, we can recommend more studies towards the conservation of native habitats and the documentation of the knowledge from the communities and in the field of medicinal plants. Additionally, through the sharing of the knowledge towards the community, undergraduate students could contribute towards conservation and search for the potentially new useful species plants. All this knowledge obtained from this biodiversity is not studied or protected now, and the biodiversity by itself is in imminent danger of disappearing from our planet. As a matter of fact, according to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, unless we decrease CO2 emissions, there is a high confidence that in 8 years the global mean surface temperature will reach to 1.5 centigrades. With this temperature, between 4 and 8% of insects, plants, and vertebrates will lose over half of their geographic range, promoting therefore an increase in associated extinction risks. These situations will be very catastrophic to many areas of the world, in particular in South America, where the predicted extinction risk is the highest from the planet. At the rate we are going now, where there are no long-term research projects in botany that are carried out by Ecuadorian graduate students in Ecuadorian institutions, and where the risk of extinction for endemic species or for native species is the highest in the planet, the only hope for doing research and conservation of the botanical diversity in Ecuador depends now primarily on Ecuadorian undergraduate students. Many thanks, and I will be happy to answer any questions.